maybe there's something else you can add.
Is there a difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardi halacha?
Yes. I don't. You can put it in whatever categories you want. Sephardim, Ashkenazim,
And
Right.
makes both?
I don't mind. Go ahead, fill it up.
What?
Go ahead, fill it up.
You can categorize them in whatever groups you want.
So we're gonna learn about that. Good morning. Let's begin our class. It's Hilchot Kashrut. Let's begin our class. Hilchot Kashrut. We had a question here about not meat and milk, but about fish and milk. And we know that milk and meat is prohibited from the Torah. We're going to discuss it at length. Also, the question of milk and fish, or fish and milk, is to be discussed very soon.
Okay.
So, but there is such a custom to be careful about that and not to mix them. But it's not a law. It's not absolute. There is a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. People here answered you correctly that there is a custom, if I'm not mistaken, among Sephardim to be machmir on this. It's a custom. It's a halacha custom. Well, if that's your tradition, then you must keep that tradition. And so, okay. But if it's not your tradition,
but that's the thing. Most of it, if people are keeping it, they're keeping it because of tradition, and they're associating it with halacha.
Correct. There's such a thing. It's called a halachic custom. Yeah. We're gonna discuss it, Bezrat Hashem, in the coming weeks, Bezrat Hashem. We're gonna go back to the laws that we were discussing about causing pain to animals. Okay. You might have not heard of this, but we're gonna discuss some strange customs which seem cruel to us, but they're actually quite part of life. Some of them, I'll start with a custom which was part of ancient life in the times where there were kings. So when a king would die, you would burn all of his clothing because nobody else should be wearing the king's clothes, right? Not only would you burn all the king's clothing, is that you would actually cut off the bottom part of the hooves of all of his horses, because you didn't want anybody else to take the horses.
Jewish tradition?
No, this was in general tradition, and also including it. So it's mentioned in the Tanakh that this was done. It says Joshua, chapter 11, says, I want you to do that. God tells Joshua to do that to all the horses. You're supposed to burn all the chariots and cut off the hooves of all those horses of those kings. And obviously they can't run too fast if they don't have proper legs. Their legs are chopped off. So this is an extreme, seems to us pretty extreme, pain to the animal. But the reason why it was done was because that was part of conquering. It's part of, it's like nowadays you'd say, taking all the firing mechanism out of all the enemy's guns, right? So cutting off the legs of or at least the bottom part of the legs of the horses was something that was done in the ancient world. And this would be an example of perhaps something which is extreme, causing extreme pain to the animals, but it can be allowed in unique circumstances, times of war. Clearly this was biblically mandated from God to Yoshua. And the question is, what happens when we have different levels of pain to the animals in the course of breeding them? Most famous case we'll talk about in a minute is with geese, right? I think that's what it is. You force feed
for the foie gras.
For the foie gras, force feeding the geese. But before that, there's another example which is more common, and I wasn't aware of this till I was preparing this class. Fascinating part of growing chicken and chicken coops, which apparently the natural course is that the average egg-laying hen, they lay eggs from the age of 6 months until about 20 months, and then they slaughter them because they stop giving eggs. Now apparently, you can extend the period for which they lay eggs by an additional by an additional, you can get till 24 months from 20 months. So it's an additional 4 months. How do you get them to lay eggs for an additional 4 months? You have to take them at, usually it's done at, in the 15th month of their life. You starve them for 10 days.
Whoa.
Is that allowed? You'll get an extra 4 months of egg laying if you starve them for 10 days. Yeah.
Investment.
So it's a strange type of investment. And the question is that allowed? On the one hand, tsar ba'alei chayim, you're causing, starving. That's pretty, not much fun for those hens, I'm sure. And perhaps there's different levels of pain that you're allowed to cause for, obviously that's a lot of money. You have 4 months worth of eggs, it could be millions of dollars, depends how many chickens you have.
You save food for 10 days.
And you also save food for 10 days, that's true. Some people say this is the standard way of farming chickens, and that's allowed, and it's not undue pain. Also, the fact that they live for a long life afterwards, it's not like any long-term damage that you're doing to them, and because and the truth is, like we did last time, comparing, we said, well, we work hard for our jobs, sometimes sweating and putting ourselves through hardship in order to make a buck. So we can demand that from the animals to be our beasts of burden, even though they're obviously working very hard and perspiring. But that's what's normal. So you could say the same thing. There are people that are willing to go hungry because they're on a job and there's no food where they are. They're willing to starve themselves for a certain amount. Maybe 10 days they would die. I don't know. But maybe people go on hunger strikes, and if they only have drink, I don't know exactly how it works. But the concept of starving yourself for the sake of, your livelihood, for the sake of more production, is not unheard of by humans. So it shouldn't be totally forbidden by chickens. Many people say that it's forbidden. Many people say it's allowed, and Rav Melamed here says we should follow the rabbis who know farming, and they know what's considered to be normal farming technique. And of course, if you look at it from the outside, starving chickens, it doesn't sound right. But if that's part of the normal process, I'm sure many of the things people do during farming would seem strange to the outsider. And he says, in the end of the day, it can be allowed. However, now we're going to get to the question of stuffing geese. It could be that what's considered to be too much pain could have a social element to it. You hear me, Ben?
Yeah.
Could be that there's what 100 years ago was considered to be normal. Now our sensitivities have raised higher. I'll take your question in a minute. And maybe we should be more sensitive and not allow it anymore. So I'll take your questions, then I want to talk about the geese. So I see a few questions. We'll start with Hirsch, and we'll go to Jacob, then we'll come back to Ben. Go ahead.
Precisely how does 10 days of starvation produce 4 extra months of egg laying?
I don't know.
Because it has to do with the hormone production. It alters the hormone production in delays
Is that right?
10 days.
Wow.
So does it get the food again with the egg production?
Yeah. It works.
Fascinating. Okay.
Hens have hormones in a lot of the same ways that human women have hormones. They hit menopause in the same way
that delays it. Okay, interesting. Jacob, what's your question?
Slightly off topic, but I'm wondering if the same principle carries over about the accepted farming practices. I don't know if you've ever seen how sometimes fish eggs out of a salmon are taken out without killing it. They're just squeezed.
Never seen that.
And it looks quite weird because the person is just holding a fish and just squeezing it, and all the fish eggs come out.
Okay.
I don't imagine that being very pleasant, considering I don't think anyone particularly likes being squeezed up to the point things come out.
Right.
But if that seems halakhically acceptable,
Right.
Because it's like a accepted practice, even though I'm fairly confident squeezing a fish to the point where that happens is painful.
Right. As I said, if it's seems to me like it's not any more painful than what we're discussing here, and it's definitely not on the level of like cutting off their legs. So, I think probably that's
Fish
going to
don't
be.
have legs.
I know. I'm making a comparison.
Sorry.
They're fins in some ways. There's some. Well, anyways. Yeah, I imagine there are a lot of practices that we're not aware of that seem strange to the outsider, but if it's part of the normal farming.
Forbidden outside of like what we've like talked about before.
We're going to talk about it in just a minute. Yeah, Ben.
Well, sort of on bouncing off of the last part of that, although I had a discussion for it.
For speaking as a farmer,
Yeah. Okay, so there are certain things that we actually like Torah prohibits regardless of like what society says, right? Like for example, castration.
Right.
Right. So why are we basing halacha on like what like Gentiles do for their agriculture? You know,
Right.
like since when was their standard of cruelty our standard of cruelty?
Right. So as I said before, it's very hard to put to draw a line and say exactly what's prohibited or not. There's some here the Rav Vosner in the Shevet HaLevi says there's 3 levels of tsa'ar, of pain to animals. If it's just a small level of pain, it's only asur midrabanan. If it's a great level of pain, it's asur from the Torah, and both of those would be allowed if it's for the sake of humankind, for the sake of your making a livelihood. And the 3rd level, something called very great pain, that is prohibited, that's considered to be cruel, and even for the sake of livelihood, that's not allowed. So, but again, how do you define what's little pain, a lot of pain, and very lot of pain? It's very hard. We just saw the story of the, cutting off the hooves of the horses. This was considered to be standard whenever a king died. That's what they did to the horses. This is the way that the matters were run. And so, and the Torah explicitly allows that in the context of a foreign nation, conquering a foreign nation. So, we know that pain to animals is forbidden, and a little bit of pain, as I said before, comparing it to just like human endeavors for livelihood, we're willing to endure a certain amount of pain. So it's a certain amount of pain for the animals is considered to be acceptable. And how to apply that is very tricky, as we're seeing, but there's no clear line. Yeah.
Are any examples given of like excruciating pain?
Well, Rav Vosner says that this cutting off the legs of the horses is considered forbidden. But
Cutting off the legs or the hooves?
the hooves, yeah.
Okay, I mean.
But I don't know.
Hooves are like fingernails, so we don't have.
Let me give you another example, and this is what I wanted to talk about: is the geese. In order to raise these geese, in animals in general, in the laws of Shabbat, we spoke about it when we were last year. If some of you were here, I don't know. Basically, you take some food. You want, for example, if you want to take a camel into the desert for a long ride, so you want him to eat as much as possible so that he'll be able to survive without any food on the long journey. In order to do that, they would, I don't know if cattle raisers do this, I don't know anybody who raises camels in particular, but they would take the food and stuff it down his throat, literally.
Wow.
So far down the throat so that he couldn't bring it up. And you can stuff in more and more food that way, and that way he'll have lots of stores of energy and he'll be able to survive for a long time. And this is the way you would feed animals. For example, even young sheep, or calves, young calves. You put the food in their mouths for them because they're too young to be able to process it. They don't have I think their teeth are not formed enough, but you want them to eat. Why do you want them to eat? Because you want them to be healthy and fat and grow up to be big so you can slaughter them and eat their meat. But so you're force feeding animals, essentially. This is standard practice. Now, also, the standard practice is about these geese, is that you do that so much, you force feed them so that they can't even walk anymore. They're so full of food. And sometimes their legs break because they can't support their own weight.
Well, Rob, just with regular farming practices with certain species of birds, just because of selective breeding, they've gotten so fat that they can't reproduce naturally. They have to be, the hens have to be inseminated artificially using a syringe.
Wow.
So, and this is for all geese.
Right. So what happens is if you do it for long enough, they forget. They don't know how to eat themselves. They can't eat on their own. They have to be force-fed for them to survive. Now, there's many halachic problems with this. Of course, maybe it's considered to be cruel. And then the problem is, well, when you're forcing the food down the throat, you're going to cause all sorts of abrasions and even tears in the esophagus, which is a treifa. It makes the animal non-kosher. So that's another problem. And some people say, well, okay, so just check the esophagus before you do the shechita to make sure that there's no holes and it's okay. And some people say, no, that's not good enough. Now, recently, there's developments in farming techniques, and instead of doing it by hand, there's machines which force feed these geese. And as a matter of fact, usually they use corn. They force feed them because the corn stays in the liver. The liver stays in the liver longer, and sometimes the liver gets 10 times its natural size because it's stuffed with this corn. And some people say, well, that's even worse than before because it's even more pain. And also this dry corn that you give them, that's going to cause more, injury to the organs. Some people say, wait a minute, and it's not worse than before. It's just we're using machines, and if you wet the corn, it'll be. And sometimes they even put the corn directly with a syringe into the side of the goose, and so it's not going through the windpipe and the esophagus, the food pipe, and you won't have any problems of treifa. And some people say it's allowed. Some people say, wait a minute, if the liver is so big that it's 10 times its normal size, it causes the geese trouble breathing because it doesn't have room for its lungs to breathe. So the bottom line is, it's a machloket. Some people say it's forbidden to breed these geese in this way. It's tsar b'alei chaim, it's too much. And other rabbis say this is an ancient tradition. This is the way farming is done. And some rabbis say in the middle, they say, I'm willing to give a kashrut on such poultry, but I won't call it mahadrin. Right? Because there's something called mahadrin nowadays, which is, there's kosher and then there's super kosher. The glatz is a special word in Yiddish, which means something that's related to animals in particular and the lungs. So we won't use the word glat, but people do use it for anything that's mahadrin. Mahadrin means special kosher, super kosher, a level above. And he says, I'm not willing to call it mahadrin, even though, it's following all the laws, because of this problem. There's an asterisk to the, it's kosher, that the shechita is proper, but there's this pain which maybe is unnecessary, or it's too much, or it's considered to be extreme pain, and so unfortunately, there's a lot of politics involved, and there's the animal organizations. I should just silence that. I'm sorry. There's in some countries they outlawed. I think the current law in Israel prohibits fattening up the geese in this way. But it's whenever you get to politics and the different social movement organizations, it complicates matters. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll take your questions. There's a lot of kashrut organizations which give supervision to cruises. Kosher food, kosher cruise. You've heard of that?
Yeah.
People go on cruises for fun. You take a week. You go on a boat and you stop off in different cities around. In these parts, it's the Mediterranean, and you get to see sights. And you go back on the boat, and sometimes the boat has 1,000 people in it and 5 different kitchens. So one of the kitchens becomes made kosher, and you get the best kashrut possible. And they advertise so the kosher consumers can also participate in this type of tourism. Some rabbis say you can make the kosher kitchen as kosher as you want. Do not call that kosher lemehadrin. You can't call it super kosher. Why? Because what are you leaving Israel? I'm talking about people from Israel. What are you leaving Israel to go on a cruise, to go to Chutz La'aretz? Some people say you're never allowed to leave the land of Israel. Some say you're allowed to leave the land of Israel for, Talmud says, for 3 things: to find a wife, or for your livelihood, or for, what's the third one?
Starvation.
Torah.
Yeah, if you're starving, if you have no food, that's livelihood. Or for Torah, to learn Torah, exactly. Those are 3 things. But if you're just going to tour, how can you call that allowed? So some people say, no, you need to also...
You're always looking for a wife.
You're always working for... But if you have a wife, that's not a heter. But there's other... One second. It's quite common to allow vacations in outside the land of Israel. You need to refresh your mind psychologically. This country can be a little bit oppressive sometimes and intense. And also there's many things that you can see outside the land of Israel that they don't have in Israel. And so many poskim allow you to go for vacations outside the land of Israel. It's another discussion. But to say that it's mehadrin, to say that it's super kosher, it's the highest level of kosher possible, that you can't do because of the other considerations. Even though the kitchen might be 100% kosher, there's other considerations of you're leaving the land of Israel. Don't call it mehadrin. Similar to what we're saying here. Maybe technically this geese, being force-fed might be technically kosher. You can check the esophagus but there's an asterisk. It shouldn't be called mehadrin kosher because there is this fine line that it's very hard to put your finger on where to put the fine line of what's too much pain to the animals and what's considered just standard. Now I'll take the questions. I'll go around the room. Ben.
So, is there any precedent or notion discussion of being like a chassid on this? Like sure, it's permissible to do anything you want, or up to like excruciating pain to an animal for the sake of human benefit, right? But at what point? Or is there any precedent for us saying, okay, we can, but should we?
100%. That's what we're talking about right now. Sure, there's some people say, I won't eat foie gras. I won't have that.
Yeah.
I don't eat this. I don't eat meat at all because of the standard in the industry of what's it called, the hoist and shackle method. There's a lot to be discussed about industrial farming. And if you want to say, I want to become a vegetarian because of there's too much pain to the animals. The chickens, the way they're forced into their coops. There's a lot of discussions. By all means, I'm not saying that they're all wrong categorically. I understand the motivation, and everybody has to do the research and make your own decision. But a certain level of pain is acceptable, just like we put ourselves through a certain level of pain. A certain level of pain to the animals is acceptable as well. And I'll go around the room. Hanan. Oh, okay. The Moshe.
So, to what part does the Rav think that,
I eat meat. You're asking me? I eat meat. Yes.
The
Foie gras, I don't know if I've ever had.
They hook the cow up to one of those machines that measures your brain waves or whatever, and while they were they saw what's going through the cow's head as we're preparing to kill it.
And they didn't see much?
Well, no, they saw a burst. Like a burst of waves as its brain is trying to comprehend what's going on, and then it just like dips off.
Of course.
So, but
no circulation, no brain.
Killing method. So for a long time in the U.S., what they would use is they would use a sledgehammer. They would just go right in the forehead.
Right. Right.
Shita is very similar. It's very quick.
Very swift, yeah. Cuts off the circulation of the brain right away. And we mentioned this before, that's why some people explain that that's the most humane method of slaughter, the least painful method to the animal. Okay, but what's your question? I don't understand.
my question.
Could that make a difference to halacha? Of course.
Let's say when it comes, let's say someone decided, okay, we're going to start doing psychological analysis on geese
Wow.
as they are,
Is that male or
as we're
female?
making.
Or is it like non-binary? Non-binary.
We did mention in the introduction to this topic.
Psychological testing on geese as when they're being prepared for foie gras. If it's discovered that wow, these geese are being tortured, could that have an effect on the decision of Rebbeim on the kashrut of foie gras?
Yes, it could theoretically. However, I think I mentioned in the introduction, we said there's 3 criteria by which we're going to determine, the different levels of pain to animals. One of them was the development level of the animal. It was how much his pain receptors and his brain is developed, and obviously, monkeys, dogs, they have emotions. We can see that, and so they're going to be on a different level of the pain, So, but the geese, I think you're stretching it a little bit. But, okay. Next, other questions? Hirsch, please.
Will you, Bezrat Hashem, have a shiur discussing the levels of kasher? Like how kasher is it?
Yeah, sure. We'll talk about it in more detail. Sometimes these definitions are not really halachic words. They're just sort of like conventions that change based on society and at times. Some places they'll call this mahadrin, and they'll call this badatz, and they'll call this glat, and they'll call this halak, and they're just terms that people throw around, but they don't really mean what they say, or they don't say it. Right, we have to discuss the halachot themselves, and then you find out this specific kashrut organization and this supervision, what are their methods, what are their policies, what are their standards, and then you decide if that's good enough for you. That's
so learn the halachot, and then learn about these modern day brands, these organizations, and you can
choose. An educated decision is what we're aiming for here, to make an educated decision. Sometimes you don't always have the luxury of making all the choices that you would want to, but you do the best you can. Okay, we'll stop here for today, and we'll continue the laws of kashrut, finishing up, hopefully tomorrow, finishing up the laws of pain to animals. We have to discuss laboratories. Can you do experimentation on animals for the sake of, making medicines is one thing. What about making creams or shampoos? Can you take animal, experimentation for that? And then what we still haven't talked about killing mosquitoes and flies and snakes. And castration we have to talk about in more detail as well. So there's still what to talk about. Okay? Bezrat Hashem. We'll continue tomorrow.